Hi folks. This week on the podcast, we're doing a deep dive into the UVF with Iain Turner, who is the man behind Balaclava Street. Balaclava Street is a blog dedicated to exploring the history of loyalist paramilitaries in Northern Ireland, particularly focusing on groups such as the UVF, UDA and Red Hand Commandos. Iain has a fantastic wealth of knowledge and was given unparalleled access to the inner workings of loyalism and specifically the Ulster Volunteer Force, or UVF. To date, he has carried out interviews with around 60 different loyalists, some of whom have only spoken to Iain and nobody else. In this episode, we talk about a lot of things, and Iain also challenges a lot of the narrative that is being reported today, specifically about Robin Jackson and the Glenanne Gang. So that's enough of me. Let's get straight into it. This is the Troubles Podcast, a podcast about the violence and bloodshed that occurred in Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and Great Britain, as multiple sides and organisations waged a bloody conflict over the status of Northern Ireland. Iain kicks things off by explaining how he ended up focusing on this specific period in history.
Originally, when I started the blog, I actually wanted to look at all the less sort of studied paramilitary groups, which is basically everyone except the provisional IRA. So I wanted to originally look at the INLA and the official IRA as well. That didn't really work out because the practicalities of it, if you are wanting to develop sort of long-term relationships with people, it would not really have worked out, me flitting backwards and forwards between loyalist and Republican areas. It just wouldn't have worked out. There's too many potential complications there. Again, originally I was looking at UVF, the UDA, the Red Hand Commando, and then as I began to get more serious about writing a book in 2017, I travelled over to Northern Ireland. I actually got a lift over on a coach with a pair of flute bands, Green Gears Thistle and Dykehead Sons of William. So that was a really interesting trip over and back.
That's the start of the research, I guess, isn't it?
And I had a meeting on the Shankill Road with a number of people who, shall we say, it would be in a position to help me with doing research for a UVF book. And at that stage, I was still looking to write a book about UVF, UDA and Red Hand. They were saying, if you would be interested in writing a book that was solely about the UVF, we would be in a position to help you. I didn't say yes straight away. I had quite a lot of trepidation because at that stage I thought, is this an attempt to co-opt me? Is it an attempt to, take over my research or push me in a certain direction?
It's very hard to know. It's very, very hard to... You have a responsibility of what you're platforming. And again, I'm saying this very self-reflexively as well, because, I had an interview recently this year where I just kind of said, I can't put that online. I just can't, because it's not giving something to the listener. It's more giving a platform to something that I don't really think is appropriate.
Yeah. No, absolutely. You don't want to be co-opted as a propagandist or a disseminator of propaganda on someone else's behalf. But to their credit, they have never tried to steer me in a particular direction. They've never tried to editorialize. They've always been, pretty hands off. But at the same time, very willing to facilitate me when I've said, look, I want to look at a particular area or I want to talk about a particular individual, and they've helped, to bring that about. So I'm actually really, really grateful for the cooperation that I've been given, because quite frankly, many of the people that I've spoken to would never have been in that room had I not had that, cooperation and approval. Yeah. The great majority of people I've spoken to have never talked to anyone.
That's wild, isn't it?
Never.
And a lot of those things are going to, because again, I guess it was the loyalist side as well, but you're looking at like the Boston College tapes, or you're looking at the fact that anything that you say can implicate anyone still to this day. So you have so much stuff that happened during the Troubles that's just going to disappear.
the one stipulation that they did have, and I haven't just mentioned the Boston tapes, the one stipulation they did have is they did not want me making any audio recordings.
Okay.
I accepted that at the time. It's easy to accept that condition, but then you're left with the practicalities of it. And what I've had to do is I can touch type. I can type a lot faster than I can write longhand. Unfortunately, I don't know shorthand. I had the opportunity to learn when I was at college many years ago, and I was told by a lecturer there was no point in learning shorthand because in a few years everyone's going to have a digital audio recorder. But there are circumstances where people don't want to be recorded. So I'm in a position of doing an interview, and I've got a laptop that's not connected to the internet. It's sort of air-gapped from the internet, and having to ask questions, maintain eye contact, hammer out what they're saying to me, trying to get as much of what they're saying as possible, and then ask follow-up questions, and then queue up whatever questions I've got written down.
That's a two-person job easily.
Pretty difficult to wrangle. As I've said to somebody before, I've been in situations where I've been sitting in a car with a person I don't know, going to an unknown location to speak to a person whose identity I don't know. This is one of the things about the UVF. It's an organization. People talk about the mystique of the UVF and how the UVF is such a secretive organization, but you really have to see it in action to understand that it's a cultural thing. That is their internal culture, and sometimes they're very cloak and dagger when there perhaps isn't a strict need for it. It's easy for me as an outsider to say that, but it's one of the things that they feels kept them safe.
Yeah, absolutely. Would this be similar to saying like the cell structure of the IRA, or slightly different?
Talking about the structure of the UVF, the UVF was always a sort of pseudo-cellular structure, even before that term came into common currency. The structure of the UVF, certainly in Belfast around the Shankill, was the basic unit was the platoon. And although it was organised on a platoon, company, battalion basis, so say, for example, A company UVF in Belfast covered the Shankill Road. And within that, there were 5 platoons earlier on. Later on, there were 4 platoons because one of them, number 3 platoon, sort of disappeared. Then on top of that, you would have the battalion structure, and it changed over time. In the early days, Belfast was just 1 battalion. But the individual platoons were basically hermetic. They functioned in and of themselves, and you weren't supposed to know the identities of people in other platoons. I'll give you an example. There was an incident that I uncovered during my research where this UVF man and a friend were working on a motorbike in a bit of waste ground in the Shankill. 2 guys came up to them and said they were hijacking the motorbike. The guys on the motorbike said, "No, you're not. We're not taking this." And the other guy said, "Yeah, we are. We're from the UVF. We need the bike." And a gun was produced. The guys with the motorbike said, "Well, I'm in the UVF as well." And the other guys apparently used the name of the senior officer in the UVF, but that led to a sort of paramilitary court-martial because this UVF man had told another UVF man that he was in the UVF.
The other guy should have just given up the bike and not said he was in the UVF.
Given up the bike. Yeah, the offence was telling another UVF man that you're in the UVF, which gives you an idea of how almost obsessively or fetishistically secretive they were and are.
I put the question to Iain if the UVF also had a problem with informers in their ranks, and what their method of dealing with them was.
In the early days, the UVF was a really, really tight-knit organisation because basically before late 1974, you could only join the UVF by invitation. You could not approach the UVF and say, "I want to join." And to be frank, most people had no idea who UVF members in their local area were. I've had quite a few people say to me that when they actually did get into the organisation, they saw who was in it, they were shocked. People they would never in a million years have thought would be members of the UVF. And it basically worked that, if you were blackballed by one person or 2 people, that was it, you weren't getting in. And they would also have situations where a platoon would say their books were closed. It wasn't a case, but the UDA would basically take everyone they could get because it was a mass movement. the UVF didn't want, certainly at that stage, to swell their ranks, because one of the things that's very, very much true of the UVF is that when the organisation gets too big, that's when discipline breaks down, that's when criminality starts to seep in. Because although the structures are ostensibly based on British Army structures, it's not like the British Army where you have an NCO class who are basically the mummy and daddy for their young soldiers. They're the ones that look after them, keep them in line, make sure they're not getting up to anything they shouldn't. The UVF, you're dealing with guys who, for the most part, have got full-time jobs, a wife and family of their own, and you can't be chasing about them, after them all the time. So the discipline structure is reactive, and it functions on the basis that you have to be able to threaten them to keep them in line. But going back to the issue of informers and agents, all paramilitary groups suffered from that. The difference is in the IRA, you would have internal security unit, the Nutting Squad, SCAP and McGee and people like that. In the UVF, internal discipline and security was the responsibility of the provost marshal. The provost marshal is an interesting position because there's no real equivalent. There's no direct equivalent in the IRA. It's an extremely powerful position. But for most of the UVF's history, the provost marshal has functioned as essentially as the second in command of the organisation. I've interviewed two people who've been provost marshals, and one of them explained to me, in theory, if the provost marshal had evidence that the chief of staff, who is the most senior man in the UVF, was doing something wrong, he could arrest him. I say arrest in inverted commas, a paramilitary arrest, and take him off and question him. That's obviously never happened. What happens is the provost marshals have tended to be, obviously you need to be intelligent, and you need to be somebody that doesn't act rashly.
Did you say that doesn't act rationally or does?
Doesn't act rashly.
Why? Because you can't be predictable?
It's not so much that. Somebody explained to me, I've asked people about situations where there was very strong suspicion that a particular person was an informant, and I was like, okay, why didn't you do something about it? Why wasn't he taken out and shot? And somebody said to me, it was 90% sure is not good enough. You have to be 100% sure. One of the other reasons is that with the UVF, and certainly with the UDA as well, there isn't the same blind faith in the leadership that there would exist in the provisional IRA, with obvious exceptions of people have become dissidents over the years. If you make a mistake, people will jump all over you. So you have to be absolutely sure. But going back to the provost marshal, you also have to be they tend to be people who are capable of intimidating other UVF men if needs be. So they often be quite intimidating, scary people. I mean, I've spoken to them, in social situations, and they don't come over that way. But you also get the impression that if needs be, they can impose their will on other people who are killers themselves. I've been in a room with UVF guys, and the provost marshal has come in, and everybody, I wouldn't say tense up, but you can tell that everybody's on their toes, and they're watching their step.
To this day.
Yeah.
I asked Iain if loyalist groups were more prone to splitting and following an individual leader in a cult of personality sort of way.
What's there?
I'm not sure if that's true. I definitely do think that the religious background, the cultural religious background has had an influence on the paramilitary groups. I mean, and the culture of Protestants and Catholics, even people who would regard themselves as being secular, they're not regular churchgoers, but the sort of stubborn independence of loyalists and unionists, and that tendency to fragment. You certainly see that in Protestant churches, as opposed to the Catholic Church, where it's completely unified.
I'm just thinking of the likes of like
But
Billy
I'm-
Wright or Johnny Adair, or you know that I know I think well, Johnny Adair is UDA, but like these were people
Mhm.
who their followers trusted them above all else, all of other hierarchy within their organizations. So that
Well, I think in Wright's case, yeah, there probably is something that my opinion on Wright is that he started to identify with Jesus a little bit too closely. I think and he's a really unusual combination of somebody, who combines, that reputation as a paramilitary operator and commander with that sort of religiosity, which you don't really see. Also, that was one of the reasons why certain people really did not trust Billy Wright, because Billy Wright had been YCB and a member of the UVF in 1970s and early 80s, and then he became good living, as they say.
he went straight edge or whatever. Yeah,
Born again Christian. He was a Baptist. And he went off, and he was a street preacher for a while. But then, and that's not unknown. That does happen. And this is going back to the provost marshal. The UVF will accept religious conversion, genuine religious conversion, as a reason for leaving the UVF, but they will watch you like a hawk. And if they get a whiff that somebody's swinging the lead, that someone's faking a religious conversion just as a way of getting out of the UVF, to become a born-again Christian, exactly, to leave the organization. And, there are people who will tell you there is no way out of the UVF after you join. Once you join the UVF, you're sworn in. The only way you get out is on a wooden box. And I've also had other people say that that's not true. I think it depends on who you are as an individual. But yeah, but going back to Billy Wright, it's not unknown for people to have religious conversions, become born again Christians, and leave the UVF. It's virtually unheard of for them to then return to the UVF after that, and that's what Billy Wright did, and that was one of the reasons why certain people did not trust him. Robin Jackson being one of them. Robin Jackson never trusted Wright after he came back to the UVF.
We then started talking about Robin Jackson, who comes up a lot in this podcast, and Iain explained that for many in the UVF, Robin Jackson became a sort of boogeyman, and once he was dead, they were happy for murders to be pinned on him.
It's hard to get a handle on Robin Jackson as a person. Even I've interviewed UVF guys that knew him for years, if not decades, and even they would say, he was very hard to get to know. He's somebody who, unless he had a compelling reason, would not let you get close to him. Maybe that's one of the mechanisms that people adopt to keep themselves safe if they're deeply involved in the paramilitary life. But yeah, bogeyman is the perfect term for it. Some of the claims that are made about him, John Weir has said, he was involved in well over 100 murders. It just isn't true. It just isn't true. They have to be clear. Robin Jackson killed people. He killed multiple people. But, this idea that, for example, over 100 people, that would be getting on for the number of people killed by the entire INLA over the course of the Troubles. It's just not realistic. I mean, I've heard rumours about this individual or that individual that they've killed 10 or 11 people, and that's a serious, serious operator. Those are more sort of realistic fails. Jackson's notoriety really comes from the Sunday World.
and they're reporting on it.
Yeah, and that starts in the sort of early to mid 1980s, because it was around that time that Martin O'Hagan started working for the Sunday World. Martin O'Hagan obviously was murdered later on by the LVF, but Martin O'Hagan had been in the official IRA in Lurgan and had served a prison sentence as a result of his activities. Martin O'Hagan is being claimed, I think Hugh Jordan, who was one of his colleagues at the Sunday World, said Martin O'Hagan was one of the gunmen who shot dead a policeman in Lurgan. It was quite an infamous case at the time. Policemen, two RUC men who were delivering Christmas presents for kids, and two of them were shot. One of them was killed. I don't know if the other one was killed as well, but Martin O'Hagan was one of the gunmen in that incident. But because of his background, O'Hagan was well tuned into the sort of paramilitary scene in Lurgan and that sort of area of Mid-Ulster in general. So he started writing about Jackson in the Sunday World. They never named him, but they invented this nickname, the Jackal. That's how they would refer to him. Or they would write about him, and then instead of Martin O'Hagan's name being on the byline, it would be by our security correspondent, Robin Jackson. And
So they could get away with getting sued or saying stuff that was,
yeah. So that's where most of his notoriety comes from.
So you think a lot of the stuff nowadays people are saying about Robin Jackson is completely overblown?
Yeah, I do. One thing I would point out is it suits a lot of UVF old hands in Mid-Ulster down to the ground for old Jacko to be blamed for everything that happened down there, because it means they're out of the picture. I've sat with people who've, in so many words, said that to me. So they're as much as it might annoy them to see these things written, they're not in any hurry to correct it.
Yeah, because it means if he's out of the picture, then the scope goes, well, who did carry out this? Who did shoot this person, From my own research, I didn't get the impression of anything to suggest this was a guy who had a great relationship with the security forces. In fact, what I actually found was that, particularly in 1975, there's this series of confrontations between Jackson personally and the Lurgan UVF and the security forces that builds to a climax. It starts off with, obviously, you have the Miami Showband murders. And before that, you have the creation of what was called the A Squad. This was the anti-sectarian assassination squad. It was a sort of special unit of the RUC detectives who were solely dedicated to tracking down the perpetrators of sectarian murders. And they started pulling in Robin Jackson regularly just to let him know, we know who you are, we're on to you. He was pulled in and interrogated after the Miami Showband murders. He was duffed up to whatever extent during one of these interrogations, and he actually brought a case against two detectives and he won it. They were convicted of assault. They were fined like £10 each, something like that. Later on, the conviction was overturned. But I guess one of the optics of that, if people see Jackson getting pulled in by RUC multiple times, they're like, oh, well, he's talking to them.
Yeah, they weren't above putting the mix in and spreading rumours, things like that. Although, to my knowledge, they didn't do that about Jackson. But there were other things that happened after that. Jackson's car was rammed off the road while he was driving his son somewhere. His son was 2 or 3 years old at the time. And the car was rammed off the road by a Land Rover. There was another incident where Jackson and a couple of other UVF guys were down visiting Jackson's father, who lived down near Banbridge. As they were coming back, Jackson was arrested. They took his car away, pulled it to pieces, etc., etc. And then there was an incident where I was told it was a Welsh regiment drove through Lurgan flying tricolours out the windows of the Land Rover and shouting abuse people who were standing in the streets. And it ended up basically Jackson stood the Lurgan UVF-2 and they ambushed a British Army unit. And I think there was about 7 or 8 soldiers wounded.
So, yeah, that goes against, well, again, probably a lot of the stuff that most people would think, that Jackson was an informer and all this sort of stuff. In fact, you're saying that he was almost taunted by the security services, or what and why was that?
He wouldn't crack in his interviews. I've been told that he was kind of a crafty person. Like, for example, the incident where he won his conviction for assault against the 2 detectives, it wouldn't surprise me if he added in a couple of lumps and bumps of his own to make it a little bit more dramatic. That's the kind of thing, I'm told Jackson was doing. He was good at getting himself out of tight spots, which is one of the reasons why he was around for so long. One of the things I have to point out as well is, it's claimed now that Jackson was the leader of the UVF in Mid-Ulster. He was never the commander of the Mid-Ulster UVF, never at any point. He was originally the second in command of the Lurgan UVF. In those days, it was the Mid-Ulster Battalion. Later on, when the UVF was reorganised, it was called Mid-Ulster Brigade. But in those days, it was the Mid-Ulster Battalion.
or 3rd Battalion. And Lurgan was B Company of that battalion. And within the Lurgan Company, you had 2 platoons. Jackson was in command of one of the platoons. The other one was commanded by a guy called Billy Hanna. 1975. Billy Hanna was an ex-serviceman. He was an ex-soldier who fought in the Korean War. He was awarded the military medal in Korea. He was a bona fide war hero, but he was shot dead by Jackson because he was believed to be an informer. It's been claimed that he had regrets. I think it was about the Dublin Monaghan bombings. I don't know if that's true. I suspect it's not true. The RUC and Army were certainly spreading rumours that Billy Hanna was an informer. The specific rumour was that he was being taken away on fishing trips, by the Army, and that he was giving information in the course of these fishing trips. And that was the reason why Jackson shot him. I'd been told that by people in the UVF, from Mid-Ulster.
But that goes against what we were just talking about then, doesn't it? The UVF doesn't kill unless they are 100% certain that this person is a tout or an informer. So do you think, was there an ulterior motive for Jackson wanting Hanna to be killed? Or do you think it was just a little bit spur of the moment?
It's down to who Jackson was as an individual. When I mentioned that earlier, that's the official kind of policy of the organisation in the Shankill Road, the leadership. Jackson was doing that off his own bat. He didn't farm that out to, a provost unit, from Belfast to come down and do that. He did that himself. I was speaking to another guy who said to me, after a while, it became difficult to find people who were willing to go out and operate with Jackson, because people were starting to say, if you're out and you're operating with Robin and something goes wrong and he even suspects that you're a tout, he'll just kill you. That's another reason why he lasted as long as he did, because he was extremely paranoid about other people, who he took into his confidence, who he would go out and operate with. One of the things the security forces realised after a while is that by constantly pulling him in and interrogating him about this event or that event or these weapons being moved, whatever, what they were basically doing is telling him what they knew about him. If you do that, you can piece things together with the jigsaw information and give somebody a rough idea of who's touting on you.
Well, yeah, so it's reverse informing. It's like the police informing to the paramilitaries in a way.
I'm not saying they did that intentionally.
Like I mentioned earlier, Iain has conducted a lot of interviews with loyalists. I asked him if there was anything that he felt that was left out when talking about the Troubles. He said that there are many things, but one is the role of women in the UVF.
Oh, well, there's a lot. I think one of the things that very little has been written about, if we're talking about specific subjects, is the presence of women in loyalist paramilitary organisations. There are people who would say that there were no female loyalist paramilitaries, or if there were, all they did was make cups of tea. Most of the women who were recruited into the UVF were in what's called the UVF Nursing Corps. So they were basically trained to do basic first aid and trauma medicine, so that, if a UVF man was injured in the course of an operation or whatever, he wouldn't have to go to hospital and potentially be, picked up for questioning as a result of that. They were trained to do that. The commander of the UVF Nursing Corps was a guy called John McFarlane, who had training as a medic from the Territorial Army. And, there were women, quite a few of them seem to have been the wives of, senior or prominent UVF men, like Paul McClelland, who was a former chief of staff of the UVF. His wife, Jean, was in the Nursing Corps. Sadie McCorkindale was the wife of Sam McCorkindale. Sam McCorkindale was commander in B Company, UVF in the West Belfast. Yeah, and as I say, in the early 1970s, when you could only be invited to join the UVF, that's how it spread. In many cases, it was through families.
We then began talking about the Provisional IRA and the UVF and their targeting of civilians.
The thing to remember here is, if you look at the raison d'etre or mission statement for, let's say, two different organisations, the UVF, the Provisional IRA. The Provisional IRA, your target set is anybody supporting British rule in Northern Ireland. So you have the army, the RUC, you have civil servants, you've got the judiciary, you have all of the politicians, you have all of the contractors who support the presence of the British Army, whether they're building companies, fruit and veg wholesalers, etc., etc. And groups like the Army and the RUC do you the favour of walking slowly up and down the street every day for 30 years wearing a uniform that actually makes them stand out rather than blend in. So if you were a provy in Turf Lodge, you could sit in your living room with an Armalite and shoot a soldier without getting up off your sofa. You know, your job is extremely easy. The professed goal of the UVF was to kill Republican paramilitaries. The IRA and the INLA don't wear uniforms. Most of them didn't work. You know, they would bounce around from call house to call house. You know, their only regular movement would be to sign on once every 2 weeks. If things get too hot for them, they can just go over the border and they'll have a safe house and, you know, Monaghan or wherever. You have a much, much more difficult task as a member of the UVF as opposed to a member of the IRA. The UVF absolutely did deliberately target civilians, and they deliberately, certainly with their bombing campaign in the 1970s, deliberately set out to cause mass casualty events. One of the striking differences between the UVF bombing campaign and the IRA bombing campaign of that time is, with very few exceptions, all the UVF bombs were no warning. No warning of any kind was given. The only reason for doing that is to maximize the number of people killed. And, you know, the UVF, when the UVF had face-to-face meetings with the IRA leadership in early 1974, they were quite frank about that. They said, we feel we have an obligation to hit back in revenge against the IRA bombing campaign, but you don't have any large businesses of your own, so we are hitting pubs and shops, etc. You know, our only way of hitting back is through terror bombing of Republican areas. That's virtually a direct quote from the UVF leaders who went to meet the IRA.
This is 1974. When was the Dublin Monaghan bombing?
May 1974.
So that was also then, I guess, reactionary upon that.
Well, David Irvin said as much in an interview. You know, the sense of, do you know what it feels like? You know, that was a prevailing sentiment, you know, amongst loyalists at that time. But the Dublin bombings were carried out with a specific intent of disrupting or bringing to an end this proposed Council of Ireland, which was part of the Sunningdale Initiative, because that would have given the Dublin government, you know, an executive role within the, you know, in the running of the affairs of Northern Ireland.
I asked Iain if, from his research, he knew who carried out the bombing.
I'm not going to answer that question, but I would know a great deal about the preparation of that attack, about the bombs that were used, type of material went into them, and so on. What I'll say is, you know, before I go on to that, you know, I've made, you know, the UVF bombing campaign a particular sort of speciality of mine. You know, it's been a particular area of study for me. I don't know why I happened upon it, but I probably spent more time looking into that than anything else, because, you know, you have people who say that loyalist paramilitaries didn't use explosives or they didn't know how to put bombs together. You know, that's ridiculous. I think it's an insult to the 150, etc. people who were killed.
We then started talking about the UVF's bomb-making capabilities, who their experts were, where their bombs came from, and what was used to make them.
What you have to remember is the UVF because the UVF was formed in late 65, early 1966. In the early days, virtually all UVF members were ex-servicemen of some kind. And the original intention was to just restrict membership of the organisation to former servicemen. It didn't pan out like that, obviously, but that was the intent in the early days. So there were people who had experience of explosives from the British Army. One person in particular I mentioned was a guy called Harry Shivers. Harry Shivers was a World War II veteran who had served in the commandos. He was in number 9 commando, and he was later, I believe, a founder member of the SBS, which is the Royal Navy's Special Forces. So he was able to instruct people in, fairly simple explosives, things like gel ignite, plain detonators, safety fuse. It wasn't particularly sophisticated, but they would have them. Most of the explosives actually came from Scotland. They would be, because Scotland in those days, it still had a mining industry, open cast mining. So there would be piecemeal thefts of, a few sticks here and there, a few detonators here and there, rolls of safety fuse that would get saved up. But it wasn't until 1972 that when the UVF was reorganised and Gusty Spence, escaped from custody in 72, and they appointed people, they referred to them as ATOs. ATO stands for Ammunition Technical Officer. It's a British Army term, and the UVF, taking its structures and terminology from the British Army, simply copied that. And at that time, how many were there? I think there were 8 ATOs in Belfast. Most of them, by that stage, were not ex-British Army. But there was a deliberate, from that point on, there was a very, very deliberate process of experimentation to get their heads around the improvised explosive mixtures. Obviously, about ammonium nitrate and diesel is the one everyone knows about. So they knew about that, but they also, probably the main one that was used in the early mid-1970s was sodium chlorate and icing sugar, bleach and sugar mix. They would get huge quantities of, it was either sodium chlorate or sodium chlorite. They're almost the same thing. There's only, I think sodium chlorite has one less oxygen atom.
Is it used, what use does it have, like on farming or something? Or
I'll tell you. In those days, you still had a textiles industry in Northern Ireland and Belfast in particular. So you had these linen mills. They would get in the raw linen. That's a sort of rough brown colour, and that has to be bleached before it can be used further. So it would be bleached with sodium chlorate or sodium chlorite. Very powerful oxidizer, and it tends to be that materials which are very powerful oxidizers are also very useful explosives when they're combined with a fuel component. The fuel component was icing sugar. They used icing sugar because the smaller the size of the particle, the more intimately you can mix the two together, and the faster the reaction, the more powerful the bomb. They would mix that. I'm not going to say what ratio they were mixed together, although anyone can go online and find this out. You would mix it together. You would funnel that into a gas cylinder. The smallest kind of gas cylinder bomb would be these little dumpy CO2 cylinders that they used in pubs for pumping beer. Anybody who's worked in a pub seen these things. But that would go all the way up to these yellow Cosin gas, domestic gas cylinders, butane or propane. That was what they called a yellow demon because they're painted yellow. One of these things, you're holding 30, 40, 50 pounds of material.
And this isn't the case that you light a fuse and it just goes off. You need a primer again, a small little a detonator, is it?
This is an interesting point. You can set off that mixture with just a naked flame or a fuse. It will, but it will not act as a high explosive. It will act as a low explosive, and that's why it has to be confined. But if you initiate it using a detonator and a booster charge, and with the smaller ones, like I'm talking about, these wee 7-pound CO2 cylinders, the booster charge for them would typically be a bundle of detonating cord, det cord, which is an blasting accessory. It looks like sort of a clothesline, but it's filled with stuff called PETM, which is very, very, very powerful high explosive. So that would have a detonator inside the bundle that would go in bomb in the center of it. When that was initiated, you would get a sort of runaway reaction where the heat and pressure inside the cylinder would rise to the point where instead of combusting, you would get an explosive decomposition, a supersonic blast wave propagating through the material. And what's interesting is that the UVF bomb makers who created these devices, they might not have known the very fine detail chemistry behind it, but they knew through trial and error experimentation that there was a big difference between the power of a device initiated with just a fuse and one initiated with a booster. Because what they would do is they would dig a small hole, like a post hole, stuff it in the ground, and they could tell by the size of the crater that was left, which device was more powerful. And they were doing this out on rural farms that were owned by sympathizers. Some of these people were well-to-do, respectable, pillar of the community type unionists. Good example, a guy called Tommy Johnson out in Desert Martin, a former JP, former Unionist Party councillor, also, allowed the UVF to use his base of operations.
Yeah, no, Geroge had a funny story. It's a great book, by the way, if you're interested in learning about the IRA's operations in the Republic. But he was saying that the guys used to, as a bit of a joke, they'd get a lump of Semtex and throw it on a campfire. So the new guys would run for the hills because Semtex is super, it's super benign, I guess. You need to really shock it for it to explode.
Yeah. It burns very fiercely, but it doesn't explode.
Did the UVF get Semtex?
Well, I'm only aware of a single bombing that loyalists carried out with plastic explosives, and it was a pub that got blown up in 1973, and as far as I know, it was the guy who did it was an ex-soldier who, when he left the army, pinched a bit of this stuff and took it with him. It was PE4, which is the plastic explosive that was used by the British Army in those days. In the early 90s, the UVF got hold of this stuff called Power Gel 900. That isn't a plastic explosive, it's a mining explosive. It's actually based on ammonium nitrate, but it's ammonium nitrate, diesel, aluminium powder, emulsifying agents, and it's produced in the form of a sort of slurry, and it's pumped into these sort of sausage type casings. It's definitely not as easy to work with as Semtex. I've interviewed several guys who worked with the Power Gel. If you opened up these cases to get the explosive, the stuff would stick to anything. It was really difficult to work with, and if it got on your clothes, you would be left with this sort of silvery sheen over everything because the aluminium powder in it. So it was a dead giveaway that somebody had been working with this stuff. The main problem with the Power Gel, certainly long term, was that with plastic explosives, if they're looked after properly, they can last decades. They eventually lose their sort of plasticity and they become kind of rubbery, but they don't stop being explosive. With Power Gel, because mining explosives are used at such a rate, they don't have a long shelf life, so it's really only like 6 months to a year. You can extend that by putting it in the fridge or the freezer. But safe to say, all the Power Gel's long, long gone. People always talk about the South African arms, and that shipment didn't actually come from South Africa. Brian Nelson made a trip down to South Africa in 1985, but no, on behalf of the UDA, but no weapons changed hands as a result of that. The South Africans didn't really take to Nelson. I think they worked out pretty quickly that he was working for British intelligence, because they weren't stupid. The arms that were imported sort of late 87, early 1988, they actually came from the Lebanon. And the organisation that was really behind that shipment was Ulster Resistance. They were the prime movers behind that.
So how were the UVF armed before that?
A lot of the weapons well, in the 1970s, a lot of the weapons came from raids on UDR and TA armories, and there was inside help in these cases. That wasn't officially sanctioned collusion. That was individual members who were either sympathetic to the UVF or they were UVF members who were infiltrated into these positions in order to do that. And there were trickles of arms that came from Scotland. As a matter of fact, Liverpool was actually a really important hub for arms smuggling for the UVF. People always talk about Scotland and Glasgow, but Liverpool was probably more important.
Because there were more ships coming from Liverpool to Belfast, or what do you mean?
Possibly, because Liverpool is a port city, but you have towns in that part of the world, places like Horby, which have a strong, loyalist presence. It's interesting. The first UVF unit formed outside of Northern Ireland wasn't Glasgow, it was Liverpool. And that goes back to, I think, either 1969 or 1970. It was actually formed originally as a Tara unit. The leader of the Liverpool UVF for many years was a guy called Harry Lloyd. He was active in arms smuggling for a long time. There's a specific chapter in the book that I've written. Late 79, early 1980, the UVF came to a realization that they were going to have to rearm in a serious way, and they sent out scouting parties across the world to look for weapons. One of the most interesting episodes is they sent a group of people to Lebanon. This was in the midst of the Lebanese civil war, to make contact with the Lebanese Christian militias. Obviously, the main one was the Phalange and the Lebanese forces. I don't want to spoil because I want people to eventually buy the book. But that was a really fascinating episode because I was able to get firsthand, accounts of what it was like to go out there and what happened to them out there. It was a really, really interesting episode. It didn't really result in any arms routes being set up. One that did come off was in Canada. Basically, the UVF made contact with two individuals, Bill Taylor and Howard Wright, who were weapons fanatics. They were firearms enthusiasts who had, quite pronounced right-wing political views. They would have viewed the IRA as part of some international left-wing movement, which I'm not sure they really were, but they were willing to assist the UVF on that basis, and the UVF got some really high-quality weapons out of that. They were smuggling. Initially, the smuggling was done. The first time they did it, they had a Chevy 327 engine that was hollowed out. They drilled out the engine, then lined it with lead foil. John Bingham, who's a UVF man from Belfast, actually got pieces of lead, sort of lead ingots, and hammered them out by hand to make this lead foil, lined the engine. And I think they got 13 revolvers, and that was shipped over to Northern Ireland. This went on for a good few years. They moved on to, after that, engines with transmissions attached, and then they went on to John Deere tractor engines. It's hard to say exactly how many weapons they got that, but you're talking, hundreds. And, they had, AR-15 rifles, they had M16 rifles, there were a few M60 machine guns, they had Ingram submachine guns.
They were well armed.
Yeah.
I've covered the Glenanne Gang many times on this podcast, who were a secret informal alliance of Ulster loyalists who carried out shooting and bombing attacks against Catholics and Irish nationalists. But what made them different from other paramilitary groups is their composition. They had UVF members, but were also composed of British military UDR members and some members of the Northern Irish Police Force, the RUC. Much of the information about them comes from the mouth of John Weir, who made a damning affidavit about a number of loyalist members. Their role in the Troubles is pivotal, as their activities could be described as state-sanctioned collusion. Paramilitaries working with members of the security services to kill Catholics, and it's believed that much of this planning took place on the farm of RUC reservist James Mitchell. To this day, much of their activities are shrouded in secrecy, and the name Glenanne Gang was only attributed to them in 2003. Iain is of the opinion that they never existed at all, and that the current narrative about them is completely incorrect.
There's no other way to put it, really. There was no Glenanne Gang, certainly not as is claimed by John Weir and the people who would promote him. It did not exist. What the Glenanne Gang is really is a reimagining or reinterpretation of, firstly, the Mid-Ulster UVF and really the entire UVF outside Belfast as the Glenanne Gang, and other units as being permutations, as they say, of this Glenanne Gang.
I feel like the Glenanne Gang could also just be saying the same as James Mitchell's farm. Because he got the soldiers and he got the paramilitaries, I think a lot of people say this was the epicenter of collusion or whatever.
Yeah, it wasn't. This portrayal of this farm as the nexus of all UVF activity outside Belfast it's so wrong. It's hard to know how to tackle it. That farm wasn't even well known even within the UVF, even within the Mid-Ulster UVF. It was kind of a semi-secret place even within the UVF because it wasn't used much. They wanted to preserve, its secrecy on the occasions that they did operate down there, which wasn't particularly often. When people talk about, over 120 murders linked to the Glenanne Gang, what they are doing, or what they seem to have done, because I haven't heard anything about the methodology that they've used to arrive at that figure. But it's interesting that if you go on the Sutton Index of Death on the Kane website and you add together all murders attributed to the UVF outside of Belfast from 1969 up to about 1980, depending on where you draw Belfast boundaries, you get either 126 or 128. So it's clear to me that what they've done is they've just blanket attributed all these murders to this so-called Glenanne Gang. And it simply does not make sense. Some of these are murders, in North Antrim, places like Coleraine.
But in a lot of cases, don't they link the weapon used, basically? That's what their tether is. The ballistics goes back to one gun stolen from a UDR barracks.
The thing is, the UVF knew about forensics and ballistic traces, and they would deliberately move weapons about, throw the security forces off the scent to confuse things. Or because a particular unit wanted to get hold of a weapon. Say they had someone coming up and there was a particularly prized weapon, say a Sterling submachine gun, that would be quite prized. They would approach them. Again, you're not allowed, in theory, to approach that unit directly. What you would do is you would approach a figure called the military commander. The military commander is a battalion level position, and their most important function was as a liaison between individual units so that there would be no cross-contamination or direct contact to try and preserve the sort of secrecy and integrity of those individual units and keep them, sort of hermetic. And some other claims saying that you can attribute a murder to a specific person because a particular weapon was used, and they're portraying it as a personal weapon of that individual. It just wasn't the case. If you're saying that a particular person is caught with a weapon, they therefore must have been responsible for every murder that weapon was used in. Raymond McCreesh was caught with one of the weapons that was used in the Kingville's massacre. Does that mean that he was one of the gunmen there? For all I know, he could have been, but you couldn't make that stand up in court. Billy McCaughey was a member of the UVF. He was a member of the UVF even before he joined the RUC. I know that for certain. John Weir was not a member of the UVF. There is no question. Those men were members of the RUC, and yet they were also participating in UVF activities. They were planting bombs. They were killing people. But they were not responsible for that many incidents in the scheme of things.
And they were not operating in a state-sanctioned way.
No, they weren't. Oh, if they were, why were they arrested and convicted? It doesn't make sense to sabotage your own policy. If there was official backing for loyalist paramilitaries, they wouldn't have been jumping about with homemade submachine guns, that could blow your hand off. They wouldn't have been as strapped for cash
as they were. The UVF was a shoestring operation. It was not a wealthy organisation. The Provisional IRA and the UDA both had a lot of money. The UVF and the INLA were, paupers by comparison. And one thing I also want to point out in respect of, the Glenanne Gang and murders being carried out in Mid-Ulster and rural Northern Ireland. At least late 1975, and I've been told this from people who were around at the time and who were in leadership positions at that time, there was a deliberate policy decided on by the UVF leadership to send UVF men from Belfast out into the country to operate with the express intention of throwing off, as I spoke about earlier, the A squad, the anti-assassination squad, so that, say, a murder's carried out in Dungannon, the normal response would be to pull in the usual suspects, the heavily traced UVF suspects from that area, and they would then turn out to have cast iron alibis. They wouldn't know that guys from Belfast had been taken out. They would probably have a local guide, who would help them reconnoitre the area, take away their weapons and clothes afterwards. But guys from Belfast would go out and do their job. I actually know one of the people who was approached. He was asked if he would go out and, operate in the country, and he had to decline because he actually had family living across the border. So obviously, as Protestants living in the Republic, if he'd been arrested, in connection with UVF activity out in the country, their life wouldn't have been worth living.
So they were sent out around rural parts of Northern Ireland to get the scent off a little bit, kind of to carry out sporadic attacks.
Yeah. To take the pressure off people like Robin Jackson, for example.
Because then we have, what was the term that was coined, the murder triangle that was happening. And all of that was kind of in and around the Mid-Ulster sort of area.
That is a perfectly valid term. It's a better term than Glenanne Gang, because it refers to the strongest, the areas in Mid-Ulster with the UVS were strongest were Portadown, Lurgan, and Dungannon. Portadown was where Mid-Ulster headquarters was, and that was it's quite interesting. People don't realise that the Mid-Ulster UVF was originally formed by former UDA people in large part. It was formed because the Mid-Ulster UDA were not prepared to go out on the offensive. And it was these people that got in touch with the UVF in Belfast and were given the okay, they were given sanction to form the Mid-Ulster UVF. This started in early 1972, and then there was a sort of gradual process of setting that up and breaking away from the UDA.
Mid-Ulster UDA were they socialist leaning, or they just didn't want to attack?
What you found with the UDA is they weren't militant enough, but in some cases, because UDA positions were filled by elections, in the UVF and the Provisional IRA, it's very autocratic. It's like the army. People are appointed by the superiors. The UDA, everything was done by a popular vote. In some cases that worked out really well. Somebody who's popular and competent could get into a leadership position or important position. But in other cases, it could be somebody who is basically the hardest guy in the room. I mean, people like that got into positions, it would degenerate into a sort of drinking club. I'm sure people in the UDA and Portadown at that time might dispute that, but the ones who broke away to join, to form the Mid-Ulster UVF were the opinion that, we need to go in the offensive. We don't want to sit in a club wearing a UDA blazer, send a wee flunky out to the bookies to put a bet on for me, collecting dues from people, extorting money out of shopkeepers.
As we approached the end of our conversation, I had a few final questions for Iain. The first being, which was one of his most memorable interviews? We also began comparing UVF leaders to prominent Republicans such as Martin McGuinness and Gerry Adams.
Well, there's been so many, but it almost seems unfair to single anyone out. But the one I was most gratified by was a guy I'd been trying to get to talk for years, and I thought he would never ever speak to me. As far as I know, he's never been interviewed by anyone before. And this is the guy who was chief of staff of the UVF in 1975. Now, this man's identity is not publicly known. If you go on Wikipedia and you look up to see, by the way, the list of chiefs of staff of UVF on Wikipedia is totally wrong from start to finish. People have made various guesses as to who this individual is. They've all been wrong. But I was really, really fortunate that I was able to get him in. I've done several interviews with him, and I was so grateful for that, because his testimony is such an important part of that period of the UVF. It's quite a turbulent period, not just for Northern Ireland, the Troubles in general, but the UVF as an organisation. There were significant changes in the leadership. There's at least 3 wholesale changes in the sort of 18-month period in the mid-1970s. The UVF, basically went on the rampage throughout Northern Ireland in that period. This guy was chief of staff in the period, when the Miami show band murders took place. When the so-called Big Push took place in October 1975, 12 people killed in one day. So it was so important for me to speak to him. Well, I call him Ivan. This guy became chief of staff of the UVF, a killing machine at that time, and I think he was about 22 or 23 years old at the time. I was interested. How does somebody of that age, get to sit in the top seat? Because the people prior to him were, older ex-soldiers. Tommy West, ex-soldier, served in the British Army. Beau McClelland, ex-soldier, World War II veteran, career veteran.
What was the answer?
He was a member of a particular unit on the Shankill Road, which was in the ascendant at that time. It's something that I go into in more detail in the book. But there were a number of people that came from this unit who rose to senior positions within the UVF at that time, and they were kind of setting the tone for what was going on at that time within the UVF. Yeah, and Martin McGuinness, what was he, a butcher's assistant? Jerry Adams worked pulling pints in the Duke of York, but both highly intelligent people, and in a wartime situation, whether they agree with calling the Troubles a war or not, or large scale civil disturbance, when it's hot and heavy like that, there are opportunities for young, intelligent, energetic and charismatic people, and I'm not sure how much charisma Martin McGuinness had compared to Adams, to accede to those positions. And it doesn't hurt that there was a high turnover of personnel, with people getting interned, jailed, etc. Because the average age of IRA commanders went from about 35 or 40 down to early 20s.
The average age of combatants in the Troubles is like what, 20 to 25.
Yeah.
The entire 30-year period was fought by people who were just teenagers a couple of years ago. I find that fascinating as well. So, Iain, thank you very much for coming on and telling me your expert knowledge of the UVF. I really enjoyed it, and I imagine my listeners will as well. So, thank you.
Well, thanks very much for having me. I appreciate it.
That brings us to the end of my chat with Iain Turner of Balaclava Street. Iain is still in the process of getting his first book published, which is all about the paramilitary history of the UVF, and I'll be sure to let you know when that occurs. We'll leave it there for now. Thanks, and see you next time.